In the suffocating heat of a Roman summer, beneath the marble arches of a cathedral packed with mourners, the body of a recently deceased pope lay in an ornate coffin draped in gold. Incense swirling heavily through the air as priests chanted prayers meant to honor his passing. But nothing could hide the truth. He had died from a disease that ravaged him from the inside out. And the same illness was now tearing through his corpse far faster than anyone expected. As the temperature inside the cathedral climbed unbearably high and the crowd pressed closer, whispers spread that something was terribly wrong. The sweet, sharp smell drifting from the coffin was not incense, and the discoloration seeping across the Pope's face beneath the glass was not a trick of candlelight. The heat was accelerating the decay, swelling the body with trapped gases, turning the funeral of the most powerful man in Christendom into a silent countdown no one realized had already begun. And then, before the final blessing could be spoken, a sound like a muffled crack echoed through the hall, freezing everyone in place. Panic rippled through the clergy as they understood what the crowd did not. The Pope's body was no longer stable. What followed would become one of the most disturbing and whispered about moments in church history, a funeral so disastrous that the Vatican tried for years to hide the details. Because on that day, under the weight of disease and unbearable heat, the Pope did something unthinkable. He rotted, ruptured, and turned his own funeral into a spectacle no one present would ever forget. Asterisk. The disease that doomed him began long before the Pope's final days. In whispered rumors that drifted through the Vatican corridors, rumors that the Holy Father was suffering from an illness no physician dared to name openly. It started subtly, with fatigue that weighed on him like a cloak, fevers that came and went unpredictably, and a strange swelling beneath his skin that terrified the few attendants allowed to see him up close. The Church insisted he was simply overworked, burdened by the weight of guiding Christendom. But those who served in the papal chambers knew the truth was far more troubling. His disease was rare, aggressive, and merciless, attacking his body in ways that left even his physicians helpless. They applied salves, brewed tonics, whispered prayers, and reassured the cardinals that the Pope would recover, but behind closed doors they exchanged anxious glances, aware his condition was worsening far faster than any of them expected. The illness caused his body to react violently to heat, swelling and inflaming his skin, leaving him unable to regulate his temperature. Even in winter, his chambers were kept cool. In summer, they became an agonizing prison of stifling air and restless nights. Every morning he awoke weaker, more distraught, his once commanding voice reduced to a weary rasp. Yet he refused to step back from his duties, insisting that the Church must never appear leaderless, even as his body betrayed him more each day. By the time he finally succumbed, the disease had accelerated so rapidly that the Vatican found itself unprepared for the consequences, unprepared for a corpse that would react violently to the heat wave crushing Rome, unprepared for the changes the illness had triggered inside him, and unprepared for the disaster that would unfold when the Pope's body was placed on display for his final farewell. The heat wave that made everything worse descended upon Rome like a curse, a brutal wave of suffocating heat that even the oldest clergy could not recall experiencing before, turning the city into a scorching furnace just days after the Pope's death. The air hung heavy and unmoving, thick with humidity that clung to skin and stone alike, and the Vatican, built from marble that usually stayed cool, became a vast oven trapping every degree of rising temperature inside its walls. Citizens fainted in the streets, water wells dried faster than expected, and markets closed early as both animals and people struggled to breathe under the relentless sun. But for the Vatican, the heat posed a far more dangerous problem. The Pope's funeral had already been scheduled, invitations sent, protocols prepared. Delaying it would spark rumors of scandal, illness, or weakness within the Church. The cardinals, terrified of appearing disorganized during such a delicate political moment, forced the preparations to continue despite the warnings of physicians who privately begged them to postpone the viewing. The disease that had taken the Pope's life made his body unusually vulnerable to temperature, but the cardinals refused to hear it. They insisted the faithful must see their leader one final time. As the heat climbed, candles melted down their stands. Incense refused to stay lit, and the air inside the cathedral grew so thick that even the choir struggled to sing without pausing for breath. Workers fanned the coffin with cloths dipped in cold water. Attendants brought buckets of ice that evaporated almost instantly, and priests whispered anxious prayers under their breath as they felt the temperature rise hour by hour. The Vatican had always believed it could control every detail of a papal funeral, every bell, every hymn, every step of the procession, but what they could not control was the brutal heat wave that wrapped itself around Rome like a tightening fist, accelerating a process they feared, ignored, and ultimately could not stop. The funeral would go on, but the climate had already made its decision. The Pope's final hours above ground were about to turn catastrophic. Asterisk. The funeral that should have been delayed began with a cathedral so crowded that the very walls seemed to vibrate, with the heat of thousands of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, each person desperate for a glimpse of the pontiff they believed to be a living saint even in death. From dawn until midday, mourners poured through the gates of the Vatican, their robes damp with sweat, their faces flushed, yet the Church refused to slow the procession. Tradition demanded that the Pope be honored immediately, and tradition would not bend, not even for a heat wave that had turned Rome into a furnace. Inside, the coffin rested beneath towering columns, surrounded by priests who tried and failed to maintain composure as the temperature climbed to unbearable levels. The Pope's body, already weakened by disease, had begun reacting to the environment in ways the physicians warned would only worsen. But the cardinals dismissed these concerns, reminding everyone that faith must override fear. Incense was burned in heavy clouds to mask the faint but undeniable odor beginning to rise from the coffin. Yet the heat dissolved the scent almost instantly, leaving a sickly sweetness in the air that clung to clothing and throats. Choir boys struggled to hold their notes, sweat dripping down their temples as candles sagged and warped in the oppressive heat. Even the marble floors, usually cool underfoot, felt warm enough to radiate discomfort. Still, the papal protocols marched forward, hymns echoed, relics were displayed, and the clergy read scripture with trembling hands as they wiped their foreheads again and again. The crowd sensed something was wrong long before the clergy admitted it. Whispers rippled through the pews, eyes darted toward the coffin, and uneasy shifting spread from row to row. But the Church had no intention of stopping. They believed the greatest danger was appearing weak, not realizing the true danger was lying right in front of them, sealed within a coffin that was changing every minute under the relentless heat. And as the sun reached its highest point, the funeral crossed a line from solemn ritual into something far more precarious. because the body of the Pope, swollen from disease and intensified by temperature, was approaching a point of no return, one that no amount of incense, chanting, or denial could prevent. The body that warned everyone began with subtle signs that only those closest to the coffin noticed, quiet details that should have stopped the funeral long before disaster struck, yet were ignored in the name of ceremony and pride. The Pope's face, visible through the thin glass pane fitted into the lid, had begun to change in ways that startled even the most experienced priests, its color deepening, its features shifting slightly as the heat inside the cathedral rose higher and higher. At first, the clergy convinced themselves it was a trick of candlelight or shadows cast by swinging incense burners, but the truth grew harder to deny with each passing minute. The glass panel fogged over repeatedly, forcing attendants to wipe it clean as discreetly as possible, while the air around the coffin shimmered faintly, the heat rising off it like waves from sun-baked stone. Priests standing closest to the bier kept glancing at one another, silently asking the same fear they could not voice. Was the body stable? The answer, which every physician knew, was no. The disease that had ravaged the Pope in life had left his body unusually fragile in death, prone to rapid internal reactions the heat only accelerated. As pressure built, the coffin emitted faint, unsettling creaks, tiny sounds that blended with the echo of prayers but made the attendants flinch nonetheless. One young priest noticed a slight bulge in the coffin's lining and whispered urgently to a cardinal, but the warning was brushed aside. Halting the ceremony in front of thousands would spark questions the Vatican was not prepared to answer. And so they pushed forward, pretending not to notice the swelling odor that drifted through the cathedral, pretending not to see the unease spreading across the faces of those in the front rows. The mourners sensed something unnatural, something wrong, yet tradition held them silent as they watched the Pope's coffin under the blazing summer heat. Every sign pointed toward impending disaster, but pride and ceremony outweighed caution, and the body continued to change beneath the ornate lid quietly, steadily, warning everyone in ways they refused to understand. Asterisk. The moment the funeral turned to chaos arrived so suddenly that no one in the cathedral understood what had happened until panic was already spreading like wildfire through the crowd. The heat inside the vast hall had reached an unbearable peak, the air thick enough to choke on, the candles bending and dripping like wax trees melting in slow motion. And still the funeral continued as if nothing were wrong. Priests wiped sweat from their brows, cardinals fanned themselves with trembling hands, and the choir struggled to keep their voices steady as the temperature climbed higher than any sacred ceremony had ever endured. Then it happened, a sharp, startling crack that echoed through the cathedral like a small thunderclap, causing every head to snap toward the source. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The chanting stopped mid-syllable. The incense swung silently in the air, and the crowd held its breath. The coffin had shifted. The glass panel trembled. A faint hiss escaped as the internal pressure finally forced the structure beyond its limits. Those closest to the bier stumbled backward, their faces draining of color as they realized the coffin was no longer secure. The cardinals attempted to maintain dignity, raising their hands for calm, but their voices cracked with fear, betraying their composure. In the pews, murmurs erupted into frightened chatter as people surged to their feet, unsure whether to stay or flee. Mothers clutched children, elderly attendees leaned on canes as they tried to move through the tightening crush of bodies, and the once reverent cathedral dissolved into confusion. Guards rushed forward in a desperate attempt to steady the coffin, their armor clattering loudly in the echoing space. But their hurried movements only amplified the sense that something terribly wrong was unfolding. And as the crowd pushed toward the exits, trampling programs and prayer books underfoot, the Vatican's greatest fear became reality. The funeral of the Supreme Pontiff had slipped entirely out of their control, transformed from a solemn ritual into a moment of pure chaos triggered by the unstoppable combination of disease, heat, and denial. The explosion that shocked the Vatican unfolded in a single horrifying instant, a moment so sudden and surreal that those who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe what they saw, swearing they could still hear the echo long after the cathedral returned to silence. As the crowd surged toward the doors and guards tried desperately to steady the coffin, the heat inside the cathedral seemed to tighten around the hall like a tightening fist, trapping every breath, every whisper, every flicker of panic. The Pope's body, swollen and destabilized by disease and scorching temperatures, had reached its breaking point, the pressure building within the sealed coffin until even the reinforced wood could no longer contain it. Then, without warning, a violent burst of sound ripped through the air, a deafening pop. Like a wooden beam snapping under immense weight, and a shockwave rolled outward from the bier, rattling the nearest candle stands and sending a gasp of terror through the room. The coffin jerked upward slightly, its lid shifting askew, and priests stumbled backward as the blast of air hit them, carrying with it a rush of warmth and a thick, overpowering smell that sent several attendees collapsing to their knees. The chandeliers trembled, incense holders swung wildly on their chains, and the panicked crowd trampled over pews and prayer books in their desperate attempt to escape what none of them fully understood. The guards froze, stunned into inaction, while cardinals' men who had spent their entire lives projecting control stood pale and speechless, their carefully composed dignity shattered in an instant. For centuries, the Vatican would avoid speaking of that moment, burying it beneath layers of revised records and softened retellings. But those who were there knew the truth. The combination of disease, heat, and denial had turned the Pope's funeral into an event so shocking that even the most powerful institution in Europe was left helpless before it. And in that single catastrophic burst, the illusion that tradition could override nature was violently stripped away. Asterisk. The cover-up that followed began almost the moment the cathedral doors slammed shut behind the last fleeing mourner, leaving the Vatican hierarchy standing in stunned silence before the shattered dignity of their most sacred ceremony. The cardinals, pale and trembling, gathered in a tight circle near the altar, whispering furiously as the sound of panicked footsteps faded beyond the outer courtyard. They knew the world could never be allowed to hear what had truly happened inside those walls. A pope's funeral was meant to symbolize heavenly order, not the uncontrollable force of decay and heat that had just humiliated the church before its followers. Within minutes, the highest-ranking clergy invoked emergency protocol, clearing the cathedral of everyone except guards sworn to secrecy and physicians, ordered to speak no word of what they had witnessed. The coffin was removed under heavy claws, carried through service corridors normally reserved for relics, and taken to a sealed chamber deep beneath the Vatican where no curious eyes could find it. Every witness, from choir boys to attendants, was summoned one by one and warned that repeating the events of the day would be treated as treason against the church. Scribes were instructed to rewrite the funeral account, omitting every detail that hinted at disorder, replacing panic with reverence, chaos with solemnity. Rumors still escaped. Of course, they always did, but the Vatican countered them swiftly with official statements insisting the funeral proceeded with dignity, that any commotion was caused by the overwhelming number of mourners, not by the catastrophic failure of a coffin under the Roman sun. Physicians who raised concerns about the heat were dismissed. Attendants who whispered privately about the Pope's illness were reassigned to remote posts. In the end, the Church succeeded in burying the truth beneath layers of doctrine and ceremony, preserving the image of papal authority while erasing the most disastrous moment in its recent history. Yet even as the world moved on, those who had been inside the cathedral that day carried the memory, like a shadow proof, that even the most powerful institution on earth could not control the force of nature, and that sometimes the truth is too unsettling to be written into the pages of history. In the end, the story of the Pope who rotted and ruptured during his own funeral is not just a tale of heat, disease, and decay. It is a reminder of how fragile even the greatest symbols of power truly are when confronted by forces beyond human control. The Vatican tried to bury the truth beneath polished words and rewritten accounts, but the reality lingered in whispers and memories, carried by those who witnessed the moment. Tradition collided with nature in the most catastrophic way. This funeral, meant to immortalize a man of divine authority, instead revealed something profoundly human. No rank, no robe, no ritual can halt the laws of the world we live in. The Pope, revered by millions, was ultimately undone not by enemies or politics, but by the same natural processes that claim every living being. And perhaps that is why the Church fought so hard to hide what happened. They feared this side of vulnerability, feared admitting that even holiness cannot escape mortality. Yet the truth endures, quietly, stubbornly, in the shadows of historical memory, that the most powerful institutions can fall apart in a single moment, that nature does not bow to titles, and that sometimes the events we try hardest to conceal become the ones that echo the loudest across time. His funeral was meant to honor him, but instead it exposed the delicate line between reverence and reality, leaving behind a lesson the Vatican never intended to teach, that beneath robes, crowns, and ceremony, every life ends the same way. And even the greatest among us are ultimately dust in the heat.